co-hosting this study of the Frontiersmen with me, and also the co-host of our X Spaces, which we'll be doing coinciding with this, where Brotherhood members will have the opportunity to come on and talk about the book if they've read it, and you'll have the opportunity to listen if you're a bystander. This is Mr. Titus Lamb, and one of the things that's really cool about doing it with Titus is Titus lives in the area where all of this takes place. In fact, he lives within driving distance. His wife went to school where the statue of Simon Kenton, the main character of the book, is. Titus, take us through a little bit of the vanguard of the wilderness.
Yeah. So the frontier in this time in history, the areas, as Cam said earlier, of Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, also the like northwestern parts of Virginia and Pennsylvania, and then on up into the areas of Michigan and I already mentioned Indiana are vastly different, I would say, than what you would find in typical accounts of this period in the United States. Largely, those tend to be focused around main urban centers, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, all these other cities. And there was a lot of really cool stuff that happened there. Lots of notable characters, George Washington, the government centers are all over there. This was the Wild West, and it, as Cam mentioned earlier, was a kind of a different breed of people that chose to go here. Life out here was hard, to say nothing of having no modern amenities. They often didn't even have what in those days would have been considered modern amenities. It was not uncommon to spend nights out in the forest out of either necessity or because you were trying to go do something. It was a fairly common thing. A couple of points of interest: weaponry is extremely common. This is not a place like walking through a place like New York City at the time, where you would be walking around unarmed. You were armed, and you can see the weaponry listed on the screen if you're watching this, but the tomahawk, the knife, and your flintlock rifle would be kind of your main things there. If anybody has shot a flintlock rifle, they know how difficult that is to maintain as far as the weapon itself, your powder, your ball, keeping track of those things, the loading of those things. Not a fast weapon, but still vital to survival and any semblance of thriving on the frontier. The knife being obviously a utility tool, but also a weapon for self-defense, up close, personal. Many, many accounts of knife fights in this book, and many just uses in general for a good tool like a knife. And the tomahawk, which also is semi-dual purpose for processing wood, building shelters, but also for sure a weapon of war to be thrown or swung at enemies. Another thing of note is the literacy of this area. There were not a lot of people who had a high degree of literacy or any literacy at all. Our already mentioned Simon Kenton, he is one of those people who is pretty much illiterate completely. He can't even write his own name. He has a mark that is his mark. As you go through this, there's lots of mentions of him putting his mark on things, and that does come into play later on in his life, which we'll get to at a later time. Frontier warfare was very different as well as what you would see on the front lines of the Revolutionary War, conventional for the time warfare, standing in lines, firing at each other. This was very akin to the guerrilla warfare, ducking and diving, hiding in trees, giving yourself time to reload from cover and concealment, all those type of things. So to understand that helps a lot in understanding the nature of what this place was like, what the people in it were like, and the conditions as far as hygiene. Things are dirty, things are not sterile, infection is a big deal, all these things, especially in a society and in a time in history when there wasn't a lot of understanding of medicine and doctoring and even hygiene. Things happened, people died, there was brutality all around. It was somewhat accepted, even though I don't think many people really relished how brutal this was. And a lot of people that came to the frontier, and I believe it's mentioned in the book, were either desperate or on the run, or they were people who were opportunists seeking to go out into this frontier to maybe claim some land, or that could make some sort of a living running a trading post, things like that, looking for any sort of economic opportunity.
Yeah, great breakdown. So one of the things that I wanted to point out there in Titus has a tomahawk, which he'll show us at some later time. But this was a weapon that originally was what the Indians used, and really quickly the settlers took it on as one of their key weapons, which is it's really cool. Then when you go watch a movie like The Patriot, where he has his famous tomahawk, and that's actually a true depiction of how they came to particularly the frontiersmen came to endure this, because anybody who fought the Indians realized that it was an indispensable weapon in close quarters combat, and was different than a knife, and also you needed something that you could grab real quick, you could wield when you were done firing your rifle, because the rifle takes incredible skill to load and to shoot, and you're obviously limited on how many shots you can get once you're in close quarters combat, which this is in the woods. So that's another thing to take into consideration. At the time, this was not developed farmland that had been cleared of its woods. This was still a very wild place. And there were plains, and in fact, basically the whole book is their journey, and they keep thinking they're going to come across these giant plains that are very Edenic, but those are further west, and most of what they're dealing with is really rugged rivers, woods, and in mountains for the East Coast that they're dealing with until they get to those wider open spaces. And then they realize that that's something really close to like the river deltas and certain areas that they would have had to, what we would now see and experience, and what has been part of America for a long time, is actually that land has been cleared to be used for farming, which is really something that gave rise to the country as a whole. So I'm going to shift now and share. We're going to walk you guys through chapter 1. So that's basically an introduction to the book. We're going to walk you guys through the play-by-play. There are 13 chapters in this book. We're going to cover one chapter about every 2 weeks in our study here, and for that, you guys will you'll get a really good idea of what makes this book incredible, what makes it unique, and why we're studying it. So walking through the beginning here, we already talked about this is Allan Eckert's novel. This is actually a really cool painting from back in the day. There's some great artwork. We'll put that out on our social media as we go through this. But we want to come at this from a lens of not only historical narrative, but Christian theology, because there is application to be had in this book. This isn't what people call a self-help book or necessarily a theological book on its face, but it teaches us some really great lessons while it's teaching us the true history of America. And that's something that we really want to enjoy as we go through it. In the overarching scheme of things, we want to talk about the fallen world and the search for Eden, because that is what gave people the desire not only to come to America initially, if you consider the Pilgrims, and there was already, as I mentioned, over 100 years of established settlers in America, really the rise of Puritan culture, where Christians came here to be able to be free and to worship God and to take dominion of the earth in incredible ways. And in fact, the greatest fertility rate in, I think, human history was during that time when you had Puritan settlers all over Americas, and they were taming the land, they were working together and really creating an Eden out of a new world. And in most cases, actually trading with the natives, trading peacefully with them, working alongside of them, and in many cases, actually converting them. And there's a really interesting and also tragic story in here of a large group of natives who do convert to Christianity, and ultimately they're martyred for their faith, which is very different from basically all of the other natives in the story who continue on in their pagan ways. Now, within this, we have natural revelation. So the pristine, deadly beauty of the virgin frontier acts as a reflection of God's untamed creation. And this is something that's, as we're diving more into the understanding of anti-Gnostic Christianity, this is something that we come to find has a correlation with Genesis, because God puts man in a garden, in a space that's protected. There's no death and decay, but his mission for Adam is to actually go out and take dominion of the earth, and not only of the earth, but of the birds of the sky and the fish of the sea, which shows us that even in the original nature and design of man, there was a necessity of what is called by guys like Stephen Wolfe, and even if you go back to the reformers, martial virtue. There was this understanding that man was put here on the earth to take dominion. And even that word dominion in Hebrew entails the opposition that will be faced, actually essentially violent opposition. And this isn't a pre-fallen world. This book takes place in the setting of clearly, obviously, a fallen world, and not too far back in history from us, but very far ahead of the Old Testament. And at the same time, what we see here is this dominion mandate is still in play. So these men, both wittingly and unwittingly, there's lots of side characters in here, and they're clearly families who are believers who embrace this manifest destiny, so to speak, to go into and to tame this creation. And what's really interesting is they have this drive towards what they believe to be the Kentucky, which serves as this type of Eden for them. It's like this promised land where they can get away from modern society and decay and warfare and all of that, and they can go find a peaceful place that no one's settled in yet. What they come to find is that there are people that have already settled there, and the natives essentially are just nomadic settlers that move all around. and come from different places. They fight against each other, and they're much more. They're living in a very similar way to even a lot of Eastern cultures and different African tribes. It's basically the nature of tribal communities. You could even look at the way that Islam has traditionally functioned, which they're going into a region to exploit its resources for a time, and then they're moving to different areas. So they don't necessarily have a home base for very long, in the same way that Western colonists and settlers wanted to have a permanent home base. And that's kind of a different drive that they have in their way that they exist. And one is we can see both of them come from the initiation from Babel. God wants humans to go across the earth and to take dominion over it, but they will oftentimes centralize and then become corrupt, and so he scatters them. And this is a little bit of what we're seeing here. So the human depravity is another really big highlight of this book, because it's very nuanced in the sense that it becomes clear who the good and the bad guys are, but within the larger framework of the good and the bad guys, there are good guys on both sides and there's bad guys on both sides. And we'll go into many different stories there and some of those characters. It's a very brutal book, by the way. This is not a book to like read to your young kids over bedtime. It's a very, very brutal book and a bloody book, but it's a great story. The brutal clash of cultures, broken treaties, and horrific violence illustrate the innate fallenness of man. And one of the surprising things about this book is you basically get used to reading how horrific and bloody it is for humans to survive, and you're just thinking, how are they ever going to establish what we come to know as America? But what we see is that they have to change their ways in order for that to happen. And this is the arc of the main character. So his narrative demonstrates that while the frontier landscape is unmarred, the humans who enter it inevitably bring their inherent brokenness with them. And I would say the settlers go into it thinking they're going to find land that they can basically take dominion of and live in peace, and they very quickly encounter violent Indians, and they have to be defended, which is where the frontiersmen come in as the natural defenders of the people there. All right, Titus, walk us through the main characters of the book. These are the two main characters. There's a lot of characters in the book.
Yeah, so the book opens kind of with the birth of both of these characters. This also to note on the way this book is written as a narrative, it goes in one direction with a certain storyline, and then it will jump over, sometimes concurrently, sometimes slightly before or after what was just happening in another story, sometimes in different locations, sometimes concurrently on two sides of a battle. But it opens with the birth story of both Simon Kenton and Tecumseh. So Simon Kenton, obviously being one of the white settlers, he comes from the Virginia area, grows up on a farm there. He is born nothing too crazy, not a well-to-do family at all. They're poor farmers, and that's the life he's born into. Tecumseh was born into a family, his father being the chief of their tribe. However, his father was not the principal chief. The Shawnee Indians are the primary tribe of Indians that are discussed in this book, and they have four tribes of Shawnee Indians. Only two of those, I believe it's the Thawagila and the Chalagatha tribes, are the ones from whom the principal chief can be chosen. Tecumseh is born into the Kispakatha tribe. The fourth tribe is the Makujays as well. But the Kispakatha Shawnee is where Tecumseh was born. So while he's born under a chief, he is not in line to necessarily be the principal chief, which does come in play later on in the notability of his story arc, which we'll touch on at a later date. The interesting thing about Tecumseh, which I'll address him first, he starts out, you hear his birth story, and then he's more lightly touched on throughout the first, I'd say, half of the book. So it focuses more heavily on Kenton toward the beginning, and then it kind of adds Tecumseh in somewhere around the halfway point. But he's born under this shooting star, which was the sign of the panther, is what they called that. And so his name means the panther passing by. As he is born to his father, Chief Puxinwa, this omen happens. His father's outside. He sees this. His mother notes it when he comes back in, and it is called, he said, yeah, that's his insoma, which is like their token of, it's his good luck charm blessing. It's a sign. It's an auspicious thing that he's going to be a great man. He's going to do great things. Again, historically, I believe we can figure out that, yeah, these, astrologically, these things happened. How much of this was said for sure right up at the beginning, we're not 100% sure, but it is known that people believe this about him, both the whites and the Indians, and it did come to pass that he did end up being a very notable character. Many people who have never even heard of this book have heard of Tecumseh for sure. So going back to Kenton, like I said, born into a lower class family, he is not a man of high capacity starting off. He's a large son, he's tall, he's strong, but he doesn't have a lot of work ethic to apply himself to the menial labor around. He almost views it as beneath him, and he takes any chance he can really to get away. He had no problem just going and doing things he wanted to do, very industrious in that. And you see that throughout the book. There's a lot of things he does, and he would spend immense amount of time and effort doing things just because he wanted to do them and he thought that they were valuable to do. So hunting, doing things in the woods, he was good at that. But when it came to tending fields, cutting wood, he did essentially the bare minimum to get by. And then he would move on and try to, at the first chance, he would slip away, received many lashings and beatings for this. And it kind of seemed his parents were almost at a loss. Like, what do we do? Like, we can't even beat this kid into submission. But at the age of 17, he's involved with a girl who'd said that she also liked him, all these things. He's has his heart set on marrying her. And then one day he finds out she's engaged to a gentleman in town who's goes by the name of William Leachman. And Kenton is furious about this. He can't believe it. He thinks in his head, his skewed view, she's being stolen away from me. She probably doesn't love this guy. She probably wants to be with me. And he actually crashes the wedding, challenges him to a fight. And as the author says, he made a miscalculation. Not only was Leachman 5 years older than him, he also outweighed him by a good bit and was a good head taller and much more experienced in fighting than Kenton, who's a 17-year-old kid who doesn't really have that much experience fighting of any kind. This guy is actually a man. And so he gets thrashed in front of the entire village, and that is kind of a mark on him. Fast forward into time, he runs in the woods and lifts logs, and he kind of has a little bit of a Rocky-esque moment there where he's like training, and he ends up catching Leachman by chance alone, cutting wood in the forest, and ends up, this is my chance. I'm going to get revenge. Well, he believes that he kills Leachman, and this is kind of the catalyst for him becoming one of the men on the frontier. He thinks, I've killed this guy in this fight, and he runs off. You don't find out until later that this is not exactly the case, that he doesn't necessarily need to be running for his life, but he assumes, I'm a marked man, they're going to hang me, I'm a murderer, and so he hightails it for the frontier. And that's kind of how the story of Simon Kenton is born, and he does eventually, fairly immediately, take on the name Simon Butler to conceal his identity. So for the first good majority of the book, he's known as Simon Butler, and only later do we start referring to him as Simon Kenton in general again.
Yeah, and one of the cool things that we were talking about is how can we look at biblical narratives and compare those characters to the arc that we see here of this character. And what's really interesting is it's very unsure that he's going to have a redemption arc. Basically, you're like, man, this guy's, we'll just see if he survives, but he kind of deserves what's coming to him. And he very nearly dies multiple times, even in the first chapter. What you have here is very similar to the story of Cain and then Cain's ancestors who were violent, and Cain strikes his brother down and he actually kills his brother, and then God finds out and then forces him to leave. In this instance, Simon thinks he's killed a brother of his, another American, and he expects that he'll face the death penalty for that. So he runs away from his family and he gives no warning. And so that's a really interesting similarity there. However, the story that I think is more closely related to Simon Kenton's as you go through the book is the story of Jacob. We talked about how there are other characters who essentially have to go to a far off land and go through this crucible. But in this story, I think Jacob in Genesis is probably the closest analogy because Jacob does something wrong. He sins and he takes his brother's blessing, and then he fears for his life, rightly so. And then he leaves and he goes on the run. Now, Jacob, contrary to what a lot of people say about him in the Bible, he's not a mama's boy. He actually is pretty tough. He goes to his uncle and he ends up protecting his cousins from being hurt by other guys. So he's clearly strong. And there are multiple instances throughout the story in Genesis, most notably him wrestling with God, where God dislocates his hip in order to prevail in the wrestling match, where you're like, okay, clearly Jacob was pugnacious as well. So this is I think a really good comparison in scripture would be the character of Jacob in Genesis. Chapter 1 is really about his learning to become what a frontiersman is and really defining what a frontiersman is because he's among the first that come to set the standard for who these guys are that later on essentially prevent us from losing the War of 1812, which is a really, it's not a spoiler, but it's a really important fact. So this is all leading up to the formation of America as a nation. So his physical transformation is that he has many months on the run that harden him physically and mentally. He has to excel in hunting, sharpshooting, and it's basically one of the things I love about this book is like they have to take if they have to hunt all of their own food, and when they take a shot, they know that when they have dropped that animal, that they have a limited amount of time to get to it and get to another area and cover their tracks and be very elusive because they're in dangerous territory where the Indians would who also hunt these lands are going to track them and going to find them and are going to kill them. So the amount of, I would say, stress that these guys had to endure just to survive is absolutely mind blowing. So he also is really good at, he comes to be able to track extremely well and to avoid capture. And he just goes through the most difficult, like reading this book, this is the most intense book that I've ever read of the physical hardships that men go through. And we're talking not only about just surviving out in the wilderness with the elements, but we're also talking about fighting, and we're also going to talk about torture. There's a big part of this book where Simon is essentially tortured like no one else. Okay. And then the spiritual darkness is also really important. He is not like a depressed character, which is something pretty cool about him. And basically, in order to survive, he has to man up and he can't feel sorry for himself. Otherwise, he would just die. And his mastery over the physical environment helps mold his character from being this lazy kid that didn't want to farm to ultimately finding what we'll see was his calling to be a man to tame the wild, which is kind of a cool aspect of how God created him. So he's deeply horrified by the violence that he sees, particularly by his companions that he comes upon early in the book. And so this is a cool art. This is basically the part of the story that we're at is his wilderness crucible. Now with that, Titus is going to take us through the story of when he first joins up with some other guys who are frontiersmen. They're essentially trappers and hunters.
As he proceeds into the wilderness, first he sticks closer to towns, a little bit on the outskirts of civilization, the farther out rural farms, and then eventually he kind of goes farther and farther towards places that he's heard of, having had an uncle who was on the frontier before. He's heard stories, grew up hearing stories of the frontier, so he has some semblance of an idea, but he has a strong draw to go figure out what the frontier is as well. And it was sort of a situation of, well, no time like the present, I guess. We're going to go and figure out what this is about. And he runs into a variety of characters, works odd jobs here and there. He ends up acquiring a rifle, so he's able to gain some sort of a tool, again, where he develops some proficiency with that and starts to be known as somewhat of a hunter and a sharpshooter. He actually made a decent amount of money on the frontier, or on the very beginnings of the frontier, as a marksman who could hunt and get people game, and they would pay him for them and all those sorts of things. So his confidence starts to rise a little bit with that. And he starts to think, okay, I can do this thing. I could be a frontiersman. No serious illusions of grandeur, but he kind of thinks he knows what he's doing, which all comes crashing down pretty quickly when he runs into a man by the name of Bill Grills. And Bill Grills startles him as he is cleaning up a kill. Turns out he was also in the same area and was stalking the same, and he sneaks up on him, catches him completely with his pants down, basically, and he is worried that the guy is going to just kill him. This guy is not a horrible, malicious character, though, and kind of takes him under his wing and says, you should come meet the rest of the party that I'm with. It's really dangerous to be out here just solo, one man. Like, you shouldn't probably be out here like this, and I can tell you're green. So he ends up going back, meeting this party, and this is his first taste of running into some seriously unsavory characters. Men who are definitely not of the moral character of Bill Grills, which is not high in general, considering he's running with this crowd as well. But runs into John and Raphael Mann and a man named Jacob Greathouse, and they're known in the book as the Greathouse Party. He has an encounter with him, almost gets killed immediately, by Jacob Greathouse, basically just to prove that you don't know what you're doing and you need to listen to me. You're basically just a young pup. But Jacob takes a liking to him and decides, hey, this kid, if he can shoot as well as Bill says, like, we need somebody who can help us. We're going on an expedition down the river. We need 5 men. We've only got 4. You can be our 5th. We'll take you in with us. Shortly thereafter, he ends up parting company with them when they run into another prolific frontiersman whose name Simon has even heard from back east by the name of David Duncan, who is kind of like one of the earliest somewhat famous frontiersmen. And they go after a party of Indians who they believe were responsible for the killing of John and Raphael Mann's family. Those two brothers in particular are extremely bloodthirsty, and they kind of serve as Greathouse's henchmen. And he ends up getting left in this little supply depot, basically trading post out in the middle of nowhere. And they said, we might be back, but here's your share of the stuff we bought. You can leave too if you want. And he's just kind of abandoned there. This is where he spends some time, ends up kind of picking back up his old routine of shooting game, kind of waiting around because they were the first real frontiersmen he'd encountered. He doesn't feel secure to go by himself. He kind of wants their company, but he's trying to get up his courage to do something besides just hang around this trading post. It ends up running into 2 other characters, a young man who's fairly green to the frontier as well, who came from, I believe, New York or somewhere up in that area. He's out in this area wanting to try it on the frontier by the name of George Strader, and an old guy who was scalped and essentially left for dead by Indians when he was a boy. He was, I believe, kidnapped by Indians, tried to leave, ran into another party of Indians. They scalped him, left him for dead. He survived due to some care from a guy who found him, and he's kind of the old salt. And he tells Kenton stories of the fabled Cane lands, this Edenic paradise, which Kenton has heard wind of before, and now he's extremely intrigued. And they said, hey, we're thinking about making a run down there to try to find it. A man with your skill of shooting could be really helpful. Do you want to go in with us? And he's reluctant. And also, again, they ended up sneaking up on him, and he was very annoyed with himself. He's a little bit of a perfectionist. He hates having shortcomings. And so it's another sharpening moment for him. And he finally builds up his courage and he takes that step to go down the Ohio River.
So they have this journey down the Ohio River, and this is where the naming of the places and the geography really comes to life. But they quickly realize that it's not as was promised, and they keep having to go further and further or decide which route of the river they're going to take. They're paddling upstream, which is extremely difficult. So there's just a lot of really interesting details of how difficult this quest is, and they're in constant fear for their lives for obvious reasons. The environment basically defeats them at this part of the book because they don't find what they're looking for. They keep finding more woods, they keep finding more enemies, and they keep finding themselves in danger. And that's where the story keeps changing and gets a little interesting. So at this point in his journey, essentially we have the frontier as what we will call a spiritual mirror. So he's transitioned from this rebellious this kid essentially in those days terms still be more of a man than most men now, to a capable fugitive, and he's living under an assumed name, but he knows what he's doing, and he's survived thus far. And he actually has survived probably with these guys, these unsavory characters, as Titus mentioned, by being tough. And even though they could kill him, they don't, because they realize that he's got a lot of potential. And then the wilderness tests their bodies, not only because basically they have to get things as they go. They can only take so many provisions with them into the wilderness. And what we learned from this is that escaping civilization doesn't mean that life's going to be easy. And it also doesn't mean that you are going to get away from yourself, because they're still haunted. You can tell that some of these guys are haunted, or they're even wary of each other when they talk, like when one guy leaves and another guy's like, hey, what happened here? What happened with that guy? What was his backstory? You can kind of see how they're hardened in different ways. Some of them, because of the terrible things they've done, have just assumed this identity of not merely being a frontiersman that's wanting to survive, but someone who's actually violent in a bad way. And others, out of necessity, are really just trying to carve it out of the wilderness because they're alone. And being alone is basically a death sentence in this instance. Now, that's something that really sets Simon apart, is he actually figures out how to survive alone on multiple instances out of necessity. But it's a pretty terrible and bleak outlook whenever he is alone, and he's very vulnerable. So that's another aspect of this story that we think is really important. We talk about this in the Brotherhood quite often, that being a lone ranger is not it's not a superpower. Like in this story, the Lone Ranger is vulnerable. He's much more vulnerable than everybody else. And it doesn't matter how tough and how badass you are and how good of a fighter that you are, which we come to find Kenton is a formidable character later on. He saves another very famous character in the book. But in spite of all that, if you don't have a fort and if you don't have people and if you don't have food, you are constantly in danger. And so this story is essentially a miracle of God keeping this guy from dying. And he keeps losing companions because of how dangerous it is. So that's something to think about as we study this book is you need a brotherhood. And Simon in the beginning falls in with not so great a characters out of necessity, but he learns to start judging and discerning characters, and he learns to form friendships based on common good and common interest, which is really the Christian component of being a brother, the Christian component of being a settler. And because of that, he becomes a great asset to all of the settlers and the families that are moving out there because he becomes a protector for them. He doesn't have a family of his own. He doesn't have land of his own. He makes his mark. He basically, and think in the course of this book, Titus, how much land does he claim? He claims something like probably the equivalent of an entire state, which is not an understatement.
Yeah,
He marks all of his own land, and he ends up not getting to keep all that for a variety of reasons because you can't just make your mark on the land. You actually have to take it over and run successful businesses, and then later on, all of the common law rights come in and you have to have like legal claim and validity and all that. But he still nonetheless is trying to figure out how to do both of those things. But the way that he's really used by the Lord in this chunk of his life is he goes from being a man on the run to essentially being a protector of the innocent, which is very similar to the character of David when he's on the run, when he is fleeing from Saul, and him and his mighty men become protectorates of people that. And so that's another great biblical call out is we have essentially here a group of disaffected young men, and the ones who are good end up surviving and helping a lot of people and trying to bring peace to the frontier. They're trying to work out peace with the Indians as far as they can. They're trying to work out peace with this, get the settlers advanced into their territories, but they find it extremely difficult, and that's why it is truly a war as you go through this whole book. That's the conclusion of chapter one. You need to go read it. And in about the time that it took us to break this down, you could listen to the audiobook on Spotify. And it's very captivating. It's hard to put down because it's so gripping and you want to know what happens next. We wanted to give you guys some context to the whole book, what our mission is with doing this. And our hope out of this is that it starts selling out and that a lot of people buy this book and read it, and that you, particularly the guys in our vein and our brothers, that you are not only proud of your heritage as Americans, but that you come to realize that the only way to conquer and to survive and to keep this land that we've inherited by God's good favor is to live in obedience to Him, and also to be truly a man, to be able to defend yourself, to protect your people. We have this illusion that someone else, the police or whoever, will protect us, but we have to have the same mindset of these men, because if they didn't have this mindset, then there would be no country while the war for independence is going on. So while you have a very small but determined portion of the population who rise up and defeat the greatest empire in world history, you have these guys pushing into a new frontier, facing a completely different style of enemy in what comes to be actually a much more formidable enemy on the battlefield in the Indians. So much so that the British basically use the Indians later on to be like their main front line when they still hold significant territories. Because after the war for independence, most people forget about the war for 1812, which we nearly lost, and they forget that there was a huge stronghold of the British up in Detroit, and essentially going all up into Canada. Many of those Indian nations, and Canada still to this day is linked to England, British Empire, because they kept that land. So this is all really important backdrop to our history, and we hope that you guys enjoy the book, and we look forward to seeing you on the X Space, and thanks for joining us.